This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. And this episode, we're about to get into it. And I know I always say that every single episode, but this one is really, really, really juicy. And it all started when I saw the internet hullabaloo about the latest Ralph Lauren campaign. And I was like, I'm sensing an episode here. And so today we're going to be talking about Black elitism. So, this campaign, it was giving blazers, pearls, soft lighting, chinos. It was giving old money, okay? It was giving, my great-grandfather was the first black dentist, I don't know, in Utah or something. And then you're thinking Oak Bluff's collection, okay? We're talking about serving Vogue realness but black. And the campaigns then started using like really big flashy terms like black liberation and black excellence. And I think, when I saw this, I was like, damn, now we really need to get into black elitism, because you know what, if we're really calling it for what it is, well, the T is that classism and elitism are not side effects. They are the literal children of white supremacy. And the T with white supremacy is that it requires a hierarchy. And, whether it's intentional or not, that black elite aesthetic kind of replicates that hierarchy, but then like labeling it black liberation, black excellence. So, this episode, I really wanted to talk about, well, what actually is black elitism? How is it different from black excellence? How the aesthetic of success is not the same as liberation, and class mobility and colorism. And so, this episode, I always say this for all of the episodes. You're not, you might be tuning in and might not agree with me, and that's absolutely fine. But this kōrero is going to be a lot more complicated than, rich black people are out of touch. And there's going to be layers to this, okay? Like Shrek, like an onion, there's going to be layers to this episode today. So, take it with a grain of salt. And if you don't agree with me, that's absolutely A-okay. Please, I encourage you to get in touch with me and we could talk about it. But before getting into the kōrero at hand, I think having some definitions is a really grounding and really helpful, because, what is it, when we say black elitism, what does it actually mean? So, when people talk about black elitism, they usually mean like respectability politics, that social distancing within black communities, class, and then when people talk about black elitism, there's also like this idea of what successful black people are, and there's like a certain idea of how they act and dress and speak a certain way, and that idea of success was really highlighted in that campaign. But I think this is the big thing that we kind of need to put a line between. So critiquing elitist systems is not the same as shaming black success, because I think the way people talk about black elitism, it's about, quote unquote, black success. And so I think when a lot of people, like when we are having this conversation about Black elitism, you know, a lot of the things that you might hear is like, so wait, we're not allowed to have money, we're not allowed to rest, like we can't go on bougie holidays now. And that's actually not what it's about. Like I think when people are talking about Black elitism, it's more talking about the systems of power behind it. So, you know, because when I think about Black elitism, I'm thinking, you know, when success does become a hierarchy and identity, it creates distance and it becomes a measure of worth. And I think a really good, like, way of thinking about it that just sets it up is that, you know, elite isn't inherently bad, but elite, you know, it literally means set apart. So I think it becomes an issue when elitism becomes some kind of snobbery. So, you know, being Black and wealthy is not anti-Black. Being Black and exclusive is not automatically harmful. Being Black and having taste for luxury is not selling out. So Black elitism is not really about whatever success may or may not look like. Elitism is about the systems of power and who is and isn't included. And I think the specific thing with Black elitism is that it becomes harmful when it recreates the same hierarchies around class and respectability that white supremacy has created. And, you know, Black elitism hasn't all of a sudden come out of nowhere as of late. I think Black elite communities have always existed. I think, like, if you go by pop culture really tells us that wealthy Black people all of a sudden appeared in 2016, you know. But historically, Black elite communities have always existed. You know, if we go back before emancipation in the States, you know, these elite communities, we're talking about the free Black communities in New Orleans, the Black landowners in North Carolina, Black entrepreneurs in the 1800s, the quote unquote Black Wall Streets across the states. And so, you know, the Black upper class wasn't an imaginary thing. It's real and it's structured and it's been around. And I think, you know, that's something that isn't spoken about enough. And I know that when we see Black people and Blackness in media, you know, there is, and again, I'm not trying to invalidate anything because there are so many ways that Blackness can exist, and you cannot ignore the history there. But when we think about how Blackness is portrayed in media, it's, you know, always associated with poverty or like the streets. But you know, Black people always had had second homes. They had wealth. They had those networks. You know, the Black elite communities, they have always existed, but we've just never seen that on screen. And so, you know, this conversation about elitism has been around because Black class diversity has always existed. So that visibility might be relatively new. I think when we are talking about pop culture, I think the conversation around Black, you know, excellence or elitism, it does center a lot around Jay-Z and Beyoncé, and they are on another level. I'm pretty sure that they're billionaires, definitely millionaires, but that existence isn't exactly new. And so the conversations around elitism have been there. One thing that I would really love to really get into is Black excellence, because Black excellence, I feel like, especially in pop culture, is been around for a hot minute now, and I think it relates to this conversation around Black elitism. I think, you know, when we are having conversations about elitism, Black excellence is always brought up and they're used as interchangeable terms, but they are actually quite different. And I think the best way to kind of explain this is talking about Black excellence as an aesthetic versus like an ethos, or like the idea behind it. So Black excellence as an aesthetic, it's all about the look, it's about the vibes, it's definitely a branding tool. And if I had to like summarize it in 3 words, the aesthetic of Black excellence is bougie, polished and aspirational. We're talking about the Obamas at the Vineyard, historically Black colleges, their homecoming fits, sorority pearls, Jordan Peele's idea of like the sunken place suburbia, but make it Black. I'm talking, Beyonce's homecoming aesthetic. And, the vibes that this aesthetic exudes, it's giving Ivy League or historically Black college prestige. It's giving curated, wealthy, stable, upwardly mobile vibe. It's giving upper class, is giving social polish, respectability. So you know what? The aesthetic is beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's very much tied to class. And then if we compare the aesthetic of Black excellence to like the ethos or the idea behind it, I think the idea that really like summarizes Black excellence is that if one of us succeeds, we all succeed. And so I think that idea is really rooted in, using respectability as safety. And I think this is where code switching comes in really heavily. It highlights like individual achievement, very much rooted in representation politics, very much rooted in meritocracy. I really hope I said that word correctly. And so I don't think that, excellence is bad. Like if you think about the ethos of it, it's not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but Black excellence is not the same as Black liberation. Because if you look at the ethos behind Black excellence, it just maintains the hierarchies and kind of maintains certain aspects of white supremacy, because look, it focuses on the individual, that survival strategy of like be twice as good. And that's something that I relate to a lot in my personal life. Like that was drilled into my siblings and I growing up. I think, and I don't think necessarily my parents were wrong for thinking like this. And they definitely were trying to protect us, because I can't even imagine what it would be like raising, your Black kids in a very white country when you are migrants, and especially the first family, first generation to migrate over. Like it's a lot. And so I think, even if it wasn't said explicitly, it was, be twice as good. So you got to work twice as hard because you do not have the safety net of, the network, or our immediate family isn't here. So it's not like we had those, like the safety or connections or the privilege, that community provides. And so if you don't have that, everything relies on like how good you are, and people are already going to be looking at you through the lens of like, discrimination. And that's definitely something that I did experience, growing up as well. So again, my parents were not incorrect for thinking like this, but they were like, when people look at you, they're going to assume so many things about you because you're a Black person, you're a Muslim, you wear a hijab, and so all you can do is rely on your results and how you show up. So you've got to be twice as good to survive. And also part of that was respectability as a survival strategy as well. Like, you've got to, be polite, talk a certain way, don't talk about certain things. Those were very real things. And so if you think about like survival strategies like that, that is not liberation. And I think it's really important to understand that representation is not redistribution. Like, how when anything in that diversity and inclusion space, there's always that like metaphor of like having a seat at the table. Okay. And I think what Black excellence as an aesthetic, what it is giving is you have a seat at the table, but you're not actually dismantling that table. You're not guaranteed to be eating at that table, if you know what I'm saying. So I think it's really important to distinguish elitism from excellence, because you know what? Visibility is not justice. And I think a really good way of bringing this home is to talk about the history of colorism, exclusion, and respectability. So you know what we're going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about Jack and Jill, sororities, fraternities, all of these organizations that kind of uphold these systems of power. So first of all, let's rewind a little bit. What is Jack and Jill? Jack and Jill of America is an organization that was founded in 1938 for Black children, and specifically for the children of Black professionals. So, Jack and Jill, historically, membership was invitation based. You couldn't apply to this, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't accessible. You had to be invited. Families were often from middle to upper class. And you know what? It wasn't just only about money though, because this sounds like it's just giving money. Cultural capital netted just as much as money. And I think it's really important to kind of highlight that, because that's another type of wealth that we don't talk about as well. It's not just material wealth, but cultural capital matters as well. Some chapters of Jack and Jill of America had colorist biases. So, the lighter skinned you were, period. We'll take you. That's exactly what they said. And respectability politics were really baked into all chapters of Jack and Jill America. So it's not like, Jack and Jill was like a organization for youth, for all youth. It was specifically for, the middle to upper class Black youth. And so the colorism and the classism was very real, and it was very real. And it was, we're talking brown paper bag tests. The colorism, damn, I'm literally a little bit gagged. Hair texture preferences. So the less kinky or coily your hair was, that was preferred. People were eyeing your family lineage up and down with a lot of scrutiny. So this is, where that cultural capital, it really comes through. And there was very much that colorism, light skin privilege, which gave you more social access. And there were so many like sororities and fraternities that were notoriously selective, and that was their criteria, honey. So, it just goes to show that this is not about liberation for all Black people. I think, all of these things, they uphold systems of power and structure. And a lot of these aspects were inherited from white supremacy, because if we're thinking about colorism, the hair texture and the skin color and the features that are preferred, they are closer to whiteness. It creates this distance from Blackness. And so, it's not like these groups are about rejecting Blackness, but they were about protecting status when white society gave us crumbs. I'm going to repeat that again, because low-key, that sentence ate. So, these groups were not about rejecting Blackness. They were about protecting status when white society gave us crumbs. So you can see how, because it's not outwardly saying, outwardly rejecting Blackness, you can see how the systems are kind of caught up in like Black liberation. But again, that visibility is not justice at all. And you can see how this like hierarchy that was established still exists to this day. And, the way that we're talking about this so far, it sounds like I'm, villainizing this. And I don't think that's the case. I hope with this kōrero, you can see that it's nuanced. And so there are some things that I think, Jack and Jill does well and not so well. I think Jack and Jill gives Black kids in white majority environments a Black community, and that is powerful within itself. And I think it can counteract the internalized anti-Blackness that children can pick up in white spaces. And that's something that definitely happened to me. And this sounds like I'm about to humble brag, but that is really not what I'm trying to do right now. Okay, y'all? When they started like streaming classes towards like intermediate / high school, it was insane how like I was almost always the only like Black kid in my classes. And it was an interesting time. I didn't think that this is what was happening at the time, but as I've gotten older and I've learned to like rethink the lens in which I view this world, and a lot of that has been kind of untangling the anti-Blackness that was built into my lens. I think back to like my intermediate, early high school days, and there definitely was internalized anti-Blackness that I had absorbed. And I'm not saying it was all because of this, but a huge part of it was because I just, after a certain age, I just stopped having other like Black kids in my class, and I was just like surrounded by whiteness all the time. It was just very easy to absorb that type of thinking and that way of looking at the world. So I don't think, that's an entirely bad thing, because can you imagine like having a, specific Black community when most of the time you're moving in white majority environments, and it's a safe place to be exposed to Black success and mentorship and leadership programs and service projects. But it also, reinforces a very narrow slice of Black identity, because as I was saying before, like Blackness can come in so many different forms. The way that Blackness can be experienced is so varied. It's not a homogenous experience. But, organizations like Jack and Jill can really reinforce that narrow idea of the Black identity. It separates children by class, and And, the exposure is mostly to other elite black kids. And it kind of can cultivate a black liberal worldview where representation is changed, but that's not the case at all. So again, like this whole conversation, I think we need to approach it with nuance, but it's not like, it's not like I'm trying to villainize, but I don't think we should be idolizing either. And I think another way of really thinking about this is talking about the talented 10th that was proposed by W.E.B. Du Bois. I feel like I'm saying that incorrectly, y'all. But anyways, who was this man? They were a socialist, a civil rights activist. They were Harvard's first black PhD student, and though they co-founded NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So it's a civil rights organization. And overall just one of the most influential black intellectuals in history. And W.E.B. proposed the talented 10th. So he proposed this idea that the top 10% of educated black folks would uplift the entire race. And so the purpose of the talented 10th was to serve and not to separate. It wasn't meant to become a permanent elite class. And I think black elitism over time has shifted into something where instead of, we rise so everyone rises, it becomes I rise so I'm not like those other black people. And I think this is the difference between, black elitism and not elitism. And I think another a really awesome lens to look at this is talking about black liberalism versus black leftism. And so, when we talk about just politics in general, where it just seems like everyone is attacked. But I think when people attack black liberals, this is done without acknowledging that black liberals are often the key to electoral power. They are not the enemies of liberation and often, the products of their own environments. And so, again, it's not like black liberals are perfect, but they are essential because, we shouldn't throw away the contributions of black moderates and professionals or middle class folks. And so the critique is not about the individuals, it's about the ideology. And I think the thing about black elitism is that it prioritizes representation over redistribution, respectability over resistance, aspiration over abolition, and personal success over collective care. And I think that is where the true issue lies there. Another way of really thinking about this is black capitalism and the myth of quote unquote buying power. So Dr. Jared Ball makes this argument that black buying power is a myth because it's framing capitalism as liberation. Dr. Jared Ball makes the really good points that, black capitalism was promoted by the Nixon administration, and that intentionally replaced radical liberation movements, the idea of like be an entrepreneur, that whole discourse kind of hides systemic barriers. And so when you think about it like at that level, representation doesn't really benefit communities, but it often, you know, benefits corporations. So when we go back to that, when we go back to the Ralph Lauren and the Morehouse Spelman campaign, you need to ask like questions like, whose liberation are we talking about here? What liberation from what exactly? And who is it that benefits in this space? And I think those are really important questions to ask. And I think the best way to answer those questions about, you know, whose liberation and liberation from what and who profits is to maybe get into the idea behind the collab. So Ralph Lauren did a collaboration with Spelman College and its partner Morehouse College, and so it's not just about fashion. There is this storytelling behind it. So, you know, the collaboration, you know, the aim of it was to celebrate Black heritage and community, because Oak Bluffs, and, you know, part of the collection is meant to honor the legacy of Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard, which is, you know, it's a coastal town, but for a really long time it served as a cultural haven and vacation community for Black families, creatives, and professionals. And it, you know, there's this idea of kind of blending together collegiate pride with coastal living, because, you know, these colleges that they're collaborating with are historically Black colleges, and so it's kind of like that prep school aesthetic, but on another level. And they also, it wasn't just about the clothes that they made. They actually had a full campaign which had a documentary which was called A Portrait of the American Dream, Oak Bluffs, in which, you know, community members, residents, alumni of these colleges and historians kind of share their stories of belonging and heritage and Black joy on the island. And, you know, there was involvement of Black creators when making this collaboration. It was conceptualized and designed by the alumni of Spelman and Morehouse working at Ralph Lauren. And then also Ralph Lauren said that this collaboration is part of, you know, what they call design with intent. It's an initiative to reflect the many facets of American life, so it's communities, history, and diversity. And I think it's really interesting when you think about like why it's centered around Oak Bluffs, because Oak Bluffs is a symbol of Black leisure, culture, and class. It's, you know, it's a different way of experiencing Blackness, right? It's rooted in comfort, belonging, and heritage. Very elite, right? Because it's a very, you know, strict idea of Black success. And the reason why it's, you know, this idea of it is this epicenter of Black success is because for decades, Black families, professionals, artists, academics have used, you know, Oak Bluffs as a safe coastal retreat. And so you have people buying homes and building generational community and passing on traditions. And so it is interesting, especially when it kind of is trying to speak to the American dream. And, you know, on one hand, you know, this collaboration was awesome in the sense that it shone light on, something that is not known, but a very rich thread of like Black American cultural history. But on the other hand, when you ask those questions of like whose liberation from what, and who profits, it's very interesting, because this is a certain like elite way of portraying Blackness, but that's not everyone's experience. Again, Blackness is not a homogenous experience, but the way that they're talking about it as if it's like the American dream, it's kind of giving like false advertising in the sense that, this is what Blackness is about. And I think that's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And I think another way of talking about, Black elitism / Black excellence and how that shows up in people's lives is talking about Black children in white spaces. And, there's a strong argument there that sending kids to white majority schools exposes them to anti-Blackness. It encourages assimilation. I mean, I can put my hand up to that. Code switching is very real. It can create identity confusion, and it kind of forces them to play the role of the only Black kid in class. And it can distance them from their own communities. And, I just want to make this very clear about this is not blaming parents, but it's talking about, like, let's name those structural systems and the power in place here, because, and I think, some parents do this for opportunity, but I think that opportunity can come with that identity cost. And thinking about that identity cost, it's like, well, who is benefiting and who is, like, just losing from this identity cost. And again, I just want to reinforce, it's not about blaming individuals or parents or the kids themselves, but it's just about naming these structures and the system. Because when you start thinking about it in this particular way, then you are talking about, you can see how the levers of what's visibility, what's actually liberation, you can see how that comes into play. And then again, you can see how that Black elitism is handled and maintained. And I think as time is time to get into Beyoncé and Jay-Z, because when we think about Beyoncé and Jay-Z, they are often held up as like the modern Black elite. They are the epitome of Black excellence. They are the symbols of, quote unquote, making it. I mean, their wealth is astronomical and their influence is massive. And you think about their aesthetics as well. It's all about luxury and legacy and refinement. And so it's shaping the Black aspiration globally. And I think they're a great example of kind of like talking about what's that difference between Black elitism and Black excellence, and what are the pros and cons of elitism and excellence, because, Beyonce's Homecoming, that whole live album and that Coachella performance, or Baychella, very much celebrated the historically Black college culture. But it was, also it was a huge branding campaign. And there's Jay-Z, who partnered with NFL after the Kaepernick protests, and people, especially in the Black community, people saw this move as like Jay-Z assimilating. And it's really interesting because if you kind of break down their music, there is a lot of Black pride, a lot of like talk about resistance and transformation. But, you know, as you can see it in their careers, as they've gotten just like moved up in wealth and moved up in, you know, quote unquote, success, they've also now included like luxury and capitalist success narratives in the work that they do. And I think especially the Jay-Z partnering with NFL, I think that did hurt a lot of people in the Black community because Kaepernick, I feel like I'm saying his last name incorrectly, but he was the one who, you know, protested to show solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and like took a knee. And a lot of people, there was a lot of backlash against that protest. And so for a Black man to partner with NFL, the organization that really silenced Kaepernick and really punished him for his protest, a lot of people saw that as like, you know, Jay-Z assimilating to the systems and structures of whiteness and that power and privilege there. And I think we just need to remember, again, I'm not trying to villainize Beyoncé and Jay-Z, and I'm not trying to make them heroes either. I think they're really good symbols, and I think they show that, you know, Black success does not inherently dismantle systems. Sometimes they fit right into them. And I think we need to think about the impact of like class and how that relates to race. You know, sometimes you move into a certain tax bracket and it very much, you know, can distance you from race, and you can still, and this is how you know that, like, you know, whiteness actually is not about the color of your skin. Like literally everyone and anyone can uphold these systems, even if it's, you know, something, you know, these systems are something that should discriminate against you or harm you. So I feel like the word should was incorrect there, but you know, these systems, they do harm the communities, you know, that aren't white. You can see how when you have that class mobility and you move up that way, it can distance you from these systems, and sometimes you can be put in positions where you're actually upholding them. And I think Beyoncé and Jay-Z is really good example of that. And I think the thing about elitism is that elitism can kind of give this false performance of like liberation for all. And I think going back to Oak Bluffs and Martha's Vineyard, you know, really highlights that, because historically Oak Bluffs was like Black safe havens and spaces where dress codes are relaxed and communities where Black families, they, you know, escaped racism and, you know, had summer homes passed down generations. So, you know, it wasn't like it was necessarily Black, but it's flashy, but it was safe and Black. But today, it's become very commercialized. It's very celebrity-driven. It's kind of become this, like, Instagram aesthetic-based experience. It's full of luxury signaling, and it's one of those environments where it's, like, see and be seen. So it's, like, it's become an aspiration, and that isn't... You know, and so the issue here isn't Black luxury. I'm all here for it. But it's when the space shifts from safety to performance. And I think that's the thing with Black elitism, is that it's shifted to some kind of performance. And just when we're talking about elitism in general, elite means that it's about superiority, right? And I think this is a really big nuance that we really need to talk about a lot more. Not all exclusivity is bad, okay? Safe spaces, period. Culturally specific spaces, period. Spaces where you don't have to explain your identity, amen. Spaces for shared professional experiences, 10 out of 10, okay? I think elite spaces in general can be healing. Elite Black spaces can be healing. But you know what? They become harmful when they shame others, reproduce white supremacist hierarchies, mistake class for character, distance themselves from regular Black spaces, and prize whiteness as the ultimate goal. And I think the key difference here is that healthy exclusivity is about safety, yo, but harmful elitism is about superiority. And I think, Black elitism is a thing, and it very much is about the superiority, parading as Black excellence, parading as Black liberation, and that's just not what it is, and we should not get it twisted. But you can see how it's seductive, right? There's this, the Black elite dream is very seductive. Because we've been fed images of Black doctors, lawyers, bougie vacations, Ivy League and historically Black college prestige, wealth, designer fits, private schools, being the first, being the only, being successful despite racism, designer fits, right? It is all beautiful and shiny on the surface, but it can also replicate capitalism just with Black faces. And so, the dream is not the problem, but the hierarchy is. And I think that's the real tea that we need to get so for real about. So where does this lead us exactly? Black elitism is not one thing. I feel like it's really hard to condense Black elitism. And after this kōrero, I don't think it's inherently good or bad. I think it's a cluster of histories and aesthetics and politics and dreams and traumas and social pressures. It's a survival strategy. It's a class hierarchy. It's a cultural identity. It's a coping mechanism. It's a form of aspiration. It's a gatekeeping system. It's a source of community. It's a source of exclusion. And so, Black excellence is beautiful, but excellence is not liberation. Like when I think about liberation, I think liberation asks there to be redistribution, to think about our systems and where that power is currently held, how to redistribute that. Liberation is very much about structural change, because our systems at the moment, especially the system of white supremacy, there are so many ways that it's maintained, and it's so embedded into our structures and organizations and our systems, and that needs to be fundamentally changed, not recreated, but with different faces. Liberation is about community. I think a lot of our capitalist system, a lot of our society is kind of highlights and focuses on the individual. And when you focus on the individual in that way, there's no room for community to thrive. And we need community. And going along with community, liberation is also about coalition and working together. Liberation is also about dismantling the hierarchy. Liberation is also about valuing the full spectrum of blackness, because the full spectrum of blackness is a huge spectrum. It is complicated in the sense that there are so many ways that blackness is experienced and can be experienced, you know, the way that blackness is portrayed in media, and the story of blackness that is most commonly told is, you know, rooted in the streets and rooted in struggle. And of course you cannot deny the history that is weaved into blackness, but also like that idea of struggle and the streets, that is just not how everyone experiences blackness. And I feel like when it comes to black elitism and even just like the aesthetic of black excellence, it doesn't acknowledge that. And so I think what I really want to make it clear is that, you know, success is not the enemy, luxury is not the enemy, wealth is not the enemy. What is hierarchy, shame, and assimilation. And I think the problem with black elitism is that black liberation will never be achieved by making black versions of white elites. It will only be achieved when the hierarchy itself collapses. And I think, Beyoncé and Jay-Z are really good symbols of that idea. Because if you think about Jay-Z partnering with NFL, you know, if it was rooted in, you know, if black liberation was being prioritized in that specific instance, you know, I don't think Jay-Z would have partnered with NFL. But then, you know, then there's the aesthetic of black excellence, which makes it feel like there is that liberation there, but it isn't, you know, and if you think about who's profiting in that situation, you know, the NFL is looking really good because, you know, when they silenced Kaepernick, but then they had Jay-Z as one of their partners, and, you know, Jay-Z is like the walking, talking story of, like, you know, the epitome of like black success, and that's who they've partnered with. Well, all of a sudden their previous actions just don't look as bad, right? And so I think that's why we need to be so, I think, honest about, you know, what is and isn't liberation, what black elitism is and isn't, and what, you know, how black excellence kind of fans this idea of black liberation. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I know it was a big corridor today, but it is an important one. And if you resonated with this corridor, I hope you keep it going in your own circles. Until the next time, stay empathetic, curious, and community-minded.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.